our two speakers, our two participants today, Sam Kooistra and Dan Greenberg. Let's welcome them, please. Okay, I can taste the mic in my mouth now. How's that? It's metallic. I'd like to introduce Sam Kooistra. Sam Kooistra is the executive director of the Arkansas Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. Before joining the coalition in 2012, Sam worked for legal organizations in Arkansas and Louisiana representing indigent death row inmates appealing their sentences. A Little Rock native, he is a graduate of Washington University and St. Louis School of Law. I'd also like to introduce Dan Greenberg. Dan Greenberg is president of the Advance Arkansas Institute, a nonprofit research and educational organization committed to advancing public policy based on free markets, individual liberty, and limited, transparent government. He is an adjunct professor of law and political science at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock and is the former senior counsel for the Center for Class Action Fairness. He served in the Arkansas House of Representatives from 2007 to 2011 and on the Pulaski County Quorum Court for 4 years prior to that. Please welcome Dan Greenberg and Sam Kooistra. Sam will begin our discussion today with some opening remarks. Sam, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Rudy, and thank you for Reason in the Rock for hosting this discussion today. I'm really excited for the chance to talk with you all about the death penalty in this form. I think it's really cool that this is going on, so big thanks to all the organizers. Can y'all hear me back in the cheap seats? We good? Okay, good. Well, so my name is Sam Kooistra. I am the executive director of the Arkansas Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. And this morning I want to talk to you about why it is that I believe that capital punishment is bad for Arkansas, bad for the United States, and why I think we would be better off without it. When we talk about the death penalty, frequently, the conversation gets on sort of grand, almost metaphysical questions about ethics, about the nature of justice, that kind of thing. Real abstract conversations. And while I believe that's, those are important questions to ask, it sort of makes the topic hard to wrap your arms around. So instead, what I'm going to do today is focus just on the death penalty as a matter of public policy. So if I told you that our government has a program in place that is hugely expensive, woefully ineffective, unreliable, and unfair, you would probably agree with me that this is something that we should rethink. And the fact of the matter is that is exactly what we have going on right now with the death penalty. As public policy, it stinks. We're better off without it. And I'm going to try and very quickly make the case for you for why that is. So first of all, what did I say here? Death penalty is very expensive. I say that, I don't mean that in like a moral or ethical sense, although arguably that's true as well. I'm saying the death penalty just in a dollars and cents way, it's very, very costly. We spend tons of money on the death penalty. So we know this because we have data from about a dozen different states who have investigated the question, and unanimously they have found that it costs more money to sentence someone to death than any other sentence in the criminal justice system, even life in prison. The reasons for that are many and complicated, and we can maybe go into that later. But in general, the dollar figure is between $1 million to $1.5 million more per death sentence the state is spending above and beyond what even life without parole would cost. So to give you some context, in Arkansas, we have just shy of 40 people on death row. I think the number is 37 right now. So that's just right there, $40 to $60 million additional the state is paying just to have the death penalty. That's not chump change. I know about y'all, but I could do a lot of damage with $60 million. I kind of shudder at what I would do with that. But that is very serious money that we are electing to spend on the death penalty. So, sometimes though, if the government spends money on a program, even large amounts of money, may be worth it if what we get in return, is a good payoff on the investment. With the death penalty, what you hear a whole lot is that, the return on investment we're getting with the death penalty is public safety. The rationale being that, would-be murderers are deterred from committing crimes because they're afraid that maybe they'll get the death penalty. And so that's the trade-off. That's where our money is going towards. That's good in theory. The problem is that there's actually no factual basis supporting that position. Just last year, 2012, the National Research Council released a report where they surveyed all the academic literature, looking at every study that investigated the issue of crime rates and capital punishment. And what they concluded is that there is no evidence whatsoever, no credible evidence at all, showing any kind of connection in any direction between capital punishment and crime rates. The connection just isn't there. So, if we're spending this money on the death penalty, if we're justifying the expense on the basis of, well, public safety is improved, we're getting ripped off. We're not getting a return on that investment. So I think that alone, it should be enough to give anybody pause. We have this hugely expensive program that's not delivering on what supposedly is the number one public policy benefit of having it in place. I think just on that basis alone, you might stop and reevaluate your position if you're pro-death penalty. The bad news is it actually gets worse. In addition to being expensive and ineffective, the death penalty is highly unreliable. And when I say unreliable, what I mean is there's always a high risk of mistake with any criminal prosecution, but even in death penalty prosecutions. So since 1973, we've had a total of 142 confirmed cases of innocent people sent to death row that were able to prove their innocence and be released before their execution. 142. That's roughly one confirmed mistake for every 10 executions during that period. And I should stress that this is actually probably a very conservative number. That 142 doesn't include people that are still on death row or have even been executed that we think have very strong innocence claims. They just weren't able to achieve the very high legal burden of proving your innocence after a conviction has been finalized. So in addition to being unreliable, I also mentioned that the death penalty is unfair. The idea behind our death penalty is that it's our most severe penalty. That's as harsh as it gets. And it's supposed to be reserved for the worst crimes and for the worst criminals, the worst of the worst. But again, this is another situation where theory and practice just don't line up. What we see with the death penalty, the number one indicator for whether or not the death penalty will be sought and imposed is actually race, specifically the race of the victim. Crimes with white victims are significantly more likely to have the death penalty both sought by prosecutors and imposed by juries as opposed to crimes with non-white victims. Compounding that is then, on top of that, it's the race of the defendant. So-called cross-racial crimes, if you have a crime where there is a white victim and a non-white defendant, the likelihood of the death penalty being sought goes up even more. There's one study that was done looking at prosecutions in Southwest Arkansas, found cross-racial crimes where you have a black defendant and a white victim, you're twice as likely to have the death penalty come into play, all other factors being equal. So this isn't something supposed to be reserved for the worst of the worst, but in reality, all these arbitrary factors are in play. They really have no business in the criminal justice system, but unless you can find a way to change human nature, they are a part of the system. And I'm not sure how to get rid of them without just getting rid of the death penalty altogether. So I've probably gone on too long. So just to sum up, we have this system that is way too expensive, ineffective, unfair, unreliable. I say let's get rid of it.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Sam. Thank you for your opening remarks. I appreciate that. You brought up a lot of interesting issues. I appreciate that. Dan, if you will, please give us your opening remarks.
Well, what is tricky in debates like this is not to confuse the abstract and the concrete. And I was sort of taken aback by Mr. Kooistra's presentation because we heard a great deal about what I think of as some fairly abstract arguments after a declaration that we want to get away from abstractions. And so I want to try to cover both the abstract and the concrete. Let me begin with the concrete. On a summer night a few years ago, there was a fellow named Henry Brisbane. Henry Brisbane decided to force several cars off an interstate, Interstate 57, which is a highway south of Chicago, and he made a woman in one of these cars disrobe, and then he discharged a shotgun in what I will euphemistically call her private parts. He then compelled a young couple to lie down in a field together. He told them, "Make this your last kiss." He shot both of them in the back. His role in these crimes was uncovered a couple years later when he was serving as a prison librarian for serving a stretch for some unrelated offenses involving rape and armed robbery. These killings that I just told you about occurred shortly after the Supreme Court declared capital punishment unconstitutional. In the 1970s, he was not eligible for the death penalty. He was therefore given a sentence of 1,000 to 3,000 years in prison probably the longest term ever imposed in Illinois. He had an extensive rap sheet even after that. The governor of Illinois, many years later, eventually commuted his sentence to life without parole. I invite you to think about whether it would be immoral for this man to face the death penalty for just a moment. Talking about abstractions and concrete occurrences is difficult, but the thing that I want to suggest to you is that ultimately we ought to think about the morality of the death penalty. And I think that the justice of the death penalty in certain cases is pretty easy to show as long as we set some ground rules. First, I think it would be very difficult for me or anybody to defend every aspect of the current system as is. I think that many of you, probably even before you heard this very interesting presentation from Mr. Kooistra, very familiar with the arguments that the system is biased against blacks or poor people or other groups. I think that a lot of these arguments in many cases are very strong. That the system in practice is unfair, it's pretty easy to show. I also think that the argument that the system in theory can be fair is also pretty easy to show. That's what I want to do. Let me make a few points about what the justice system and what government is supposed to do. One reason that government is valuable is it's an efficient provider of certain services. It would be really hard for all of us to individually hire our own police force, our own court system. There's a reason we delegate provisions of that sort of thing to the government. These things are called public goods. It makes perfect sense for the government to take care of police services and courts rather than having some sort of anarchist society where we individually provide our own police and court systems. One of the things that it makes a lot of sense to socialize, have the government take care of, is the criminal justice system. I certainly know of a few bad actors who deserve to be in jail. It wouldn't make sense for you and me to have the authority to go out and put them in jail individually. There's a reason that we want to have the government to do this. It's not just economic efficiency. The primary reason we want to have individualized or socialized or collectivized criminal justice system, it has to do with human nature. A lot of us have suffered from crimes that others have committed. A lot of us want to see bad actors punished, and a socialized system of punishment represents an attempt to reduce the dangers of unfairness and bias that we'd see when individuals carry out their own punishment. Can I show that slide that I brought? Okay, which I think sort of reveals something interesting about our own desires, about how to enforce our own desires about fairness and justice. Can everybody read that? Now, what I think that slide demonstrates, maybe not in an entirely serious way, but what I think that slide demonstrates is that people get very upset when they're wronged or when they see other people being wronged. And the collective justice system provides a very good substitute for individual vengeance. Individual punishment is very dangerous. It lends itself to abuse. And I understand that we're all concerned that the whole system of punishment needs significant reform. I just ask you to remember it's always going to be true that whatever system people build is going to need constant reform and improvement. That's actually not an argument against a criminal justice system. It's an argument that we need a better criminal justice system. And let me say that the socialization of punishment might obscure something that's very important. Let me make this point one more time. A big reason that the socialization of punishment works is because it provides a substitute for individualized vengeance. And the reason I think that this really speaks to the death penalty is that when socialized punishment is not consistent with people's natural judgments about the fairness of the system, then socialized punishment is not going to work. And the more people think that the system doesn't embody appropriate values, the less helpful it's going to be in deterring what I would call private vengeance. And one of those values is very serious punishment for very serious crimes, like the crimes that I just talked to you about Henry Brisbane. I think that in certain cases, serious punishment is appropriate for serious crimes, and for very serious crimes, I think the ultimate punishment, death penalty, is appropriate. I'm not convinced that, as some people say, death is different. Some people say that the death penalty is different from and categorically crueler than life in prison. I think that's wrong. I think the death penalty is at one end of a spectrum of punishments. A lot of people say that death is different and we just can't regard death in the same way that we would regard life in prison. But a lot of people also believe in ghosts and haunted houses. And I would simply invite you to apply the same scrutiny to the idea that death is so different from life in prison. I'd ask you to apply the same scrutiny to that idea than, some of you have applied scrutiny to some other ideas that a lot of people in this room think are bad, having to do with, I don't know, organized religion or ghosts or haunted houses or something like that. I think punishment, in some cases, is its own justification for very bad actions, and in those cases, the ultimate punishment's appropriate.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Dan. I hope you all are taking notes, because this is some pretty good stuff.
There will be a quiz later.
Yeah. Well, Sam, if you'd like to provide a response to what some of the things that Dan brought up in his opening remarks, you're welcome to at this point.
Sure. I would just, I think Dan raised some excellent points. One thing he mentioned is that, Dan said that, our criminal justice system isn't perfect, and that's not a reason to get rid of the death penalty. I actually have quite the opposite feeling. I agree. I think any observer would agree that there are significant problems with our criminal justice system. And the problem with having the death penalty in that context is that it is a final punishment. We have the system we have is supposed to, we only get the death penalty in theory when it's someone who's very deserving of the death penalty. We only give it when we're certain that the person who receives the death penalty is guilty. Right? I would hate to imagine that we're giving it anything but those circumstances. But the fact is, we do that. We have innocent people that are on death row. We know for a fact that all these arbitrary factors, notably race, economics, plays into who gets the death penalty. So I think just saying, yeah, it's a work in progress, but we still need to keep it, sort of belies the truth that we have a flawed human system. As long as people are part of the criminal justice system, it will be flawed. And these are, I think, when you have death, which is such a final punishment, you can't just say, yeah, I'm sorry you got executed, but even though you're innocent, I'm sorry you got executed, even though your culpability wasn't at the same level as someone else. But as a human system, we're working on it. I'm not really comfortable with that. Another thing, Dan pointed to a few, really horrific. He pointed to a really horrific case out of Illinois that came, I guess, back in the 70s. And you hear that a lot. There are a lot of very horrific crimes that are committed. You can't deny that. But the problem with pointing to these individual horrific crimes and saying this is why we have a death penalty is that the system we have in place can't function just by saying, okay, well, this is horrific enough. This reaches the level where we have to have a death penalty. Because again, in theory, the system we have in place now is supposed to do that. Right? It's supposed to only punish the worst of the worst offenders with the death penalty. We already have a special trial structure in place that's supposed to ensure that happens. But again, in practice, that's actually not what happens. I'm not sure how you improve the death penalty system, you improve the criminal justice system in such a way that remedies that. We've already done our best, and that's just not what we haven't gotten the results we wanted out of that. So,
thank you, Sam. I appreciate your response. Now, Dan, if you wish, you have an opportunity to respond to what Sam just said.
I want to make one point about the finality of death. Death is extremely final, right? We all agree on that. And people often say, the death penalty is special because it is, as they say, irrevocable, which is very much like final, I think. But you can't fix it. Once you have a death penalty that's administered, you can't fix it. I just want to make a general point about punishment, and it seems to me that some people overlook this about punishment, which is that if I serve a term of 10 years, I will never get those 10 years back. A lot of punishments are irrevocable, right? And so the idea that the death penalty is special because it is irrevocable, I think represents something that, if not quite a mistake, certainly needs more analysis, because I think a lot of people sort of misunderstand the nature in which the death penalty is irrevocable. Everything is irrevocable if we're saying you can't get it back, okay? Every type of punishment is irrevocable. We're never going to get those 10 years back if someone's wrongly sentenced to 10 years. I think a lot of the arguments that are made against the death penalty are more broadly arguments that also apply to punishment. And if we're going to demonstrate that certain punishments shouldn't be applied, maybe we're at risk of proving too much, right? So that's sort of the large point I'd want to make about irrevocability. I think we have to be careful about saying just the death penalty that's like this. a lot of punishments are like this. The only thing that the death penalty does is it, to be crass about it, it brings about something that's going to eventually happen anyway. And so that's an analytic point. It's not a point about justice. But it's very important to realize all punishments are irrevocable in the sense that all punishments can't be withdrawn or fixed once they've been applied. Okay?
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate that response. It was most provocative. I appreciate your comments. If anyone wishes to pose a question to our panel, thank you for raising your hand, but I was going to ask you to queue up here on the row closest to the microphone, and then that way we'll know who all is at the ready. And if you got a question ready, we will open the floor to open for questions here in a moment. I want to give, however, Sam an opportunity to either respond to Dan's comments, or we can go to questions from the floor as it's his turn.
I'd like to just go ahead to questions from the floor.
Okay, super. Thank you, Sam. Miss?
I have I guess two. First of all, what is the criteria? Does DNA evidence, can we not fix a dysfunctional legal system that when we have murders like the Petit murders, they were horrific, those people were guilty, they're not going to change, they may already be dead, but when you have things like that are concrete, I see the death penalty as the only thing. Don't house them, don't have appeal after appeal, and I also think it helps to make people that are guilty, they'll say, okay, I'll do a life sentence. They become more honest and say that they did it, so that they don't have to go up against the death penalty. So it does save money.
Oh.
How do you feel about any of those?
Thank you, Miss. You brought up a lot of issues, and I wasn't taking very good notes. So I apologize. But Dan, if you will please respond to her.
Well, I'm just going to,
ready.
I mean, I think it was more for Sam, but I'm just going to say very briefly, I think that a lot of this has to do with your basic views about whether punishment is fair and retribution is fair. And I mean, I think there are some people who really don't believe that severe offenses deserve severe punishments. I think there are some people who really don't believe that punishment in itself doesn't have to be explained or justified. I think that at a certain point, if you do something really bad, it's appropriate that you be punished. And that's really what the argument for, in theory, the death penalty is. And some people just don't see that, which I respect. I just don't agree with that. And so I think that what we just heard was a very eloquent statement of the fact that, you know, some people do bad things, and they deserve, in consequence, very bad punishments.
Very good. Thank you, Dan. Sam, please respond.
Sure. So just to address, I guess, more directly some things you just said. So regarding certainty in DNA, you know, we watch CSI, CTV. They're finding some DNA hidden under a book or whatever. I don't know. But that's TV. In reality, the vast majority of criminal prosecutions, DNA isn't going to be available. And actually, if you look at, as mentioned, there have been 142 exonerations since 1973. Only about a dozen of those were exonerations on the basis of DNA evidence. So, you know, we like to view DNA as this magic bullet that's going to fix, you know, the problems with wrongful conviction that will give us certainty in a case, but it's just not true. As a matter of fact, and sometimes DNA can have the opposite effect. There's a case pending right now in Arkansas, a guy on death row who was convicted on the basis of DNA evidence. We found out 10 years after his conviction that the DNA that was used to convict him was probably contaminated. There were lab notes that were withheld by prosecutors that showed that they had done the lab procedure wrong and created a large risk of contamination. So at the trial, we thought we had this magic bullet DNA that showed he did it. Now, 10 years after the fact, 10 years on death row, we found out, oh wait, that reliable DNA evidence, not so reliable anymore. As a matter of fact, Maryland actually became the 18th state to get rid of the death penalty. They did that earlier this year. In 2011, you know, there was a drive to abolish it then. They said, well, let's push back on this. Let's build a structure where you have to have, you know, either so many eyewitnesses, you have to have DNA evidence, set up a system where we have to be absolutely certain. And after just 2 years under that, it was such a failure. It was just such an untenable system that it didn't work. So that 2 years later, they went from just having this severely restricted death penalty system, just getting rid of it altogether. And that makes sense, too, because you're setting up a system where it's not the worst of the worst crimes or worst criminals who are getting the death penalty. It's the ones where you have the right kind of evidence. And that, again, is not what the system is supposed to be set up to do. The other thing you mentioned just regarding cost is that, the death penalty saves money because it's a bargaining chip that people that might, be willing to, confess to their crimes. Right now in Arkansas, the only other punishment for capital murder is life in prison without the possibility of parole. I think, Dan was talking about how, some people are just afraid of severe punishments. You can't tell me that life in prison without the possibility of parole. It's not a very extreme punishment. Most people that get involved in violent crimes are young people, my age, younger, people in their early 20s. You tell a 22-year-old man, you don't get to see your family, you don't get to control any element of your life, you don't get to date, you don't get to hold a job, build a career. You spend the rest of your life in prison, have no control over anything you do. One, that's a severe punishment, and two, if your alternative is that or life possibly with maybe the possibility of parole 40, 50 years down the line, I think that's a useful bargaining chip. And then I guess I'm sorry, I've gone too long, so I'll stop.
No, you're good.
Well, I'll just say then the last thing is, when we're talking about costs, another thing, a lot of the costs from the death penalty are incurred independent from, if you're house people on death row for 20 years or whatever. A lot of the costs come in the investigative phase and the trial phase. So even if, the death penalty isn't even imposed, just the fact that it's on the table raises the cost of the entire process.
Thank you, Sam. Appreciate that. Dan, would you like to respond briefly, or should we go to the next question?
I guess I'd just make one point that I'm not sure that I agree with Sam's suggestion that life in prison and the death penalty are at the same level of being very extreme punishments. And I think that the evidence for this is that most people who are on death row are regularly appealing in an attempt to preserve and extend their life. So clearly, a lot of these people think that the death penalty is more extreme a punishment than life in prison. So that's, I think, some evidence against what I take to be Sam's view on this question.
Interesting. Thank you, Dan. Let's go to the next question, please, sir.
You made the statement earlier that you didn't think that there was any basis for considering the death penalty to be fundamentally different from other punishments, that there is nothing about the death penalty that is different for imprisonment over various different periods of time. Now, the fact that, as far as I know, there's no way to take back a death sentence. There is no way to reverse it. There's no way to stop imposing it. If you have someone in prison on death row, and it is discovered that this person is innocent, they can be released. You can stop imposing the penalty. It is impossible to stop imposing the death penalty. Okay. I think that is a fundamentally different characteristic that is different in kind than any imprisonment.
Thank you. Thank you for making that point and asking the question. Now, Dan gets to go first this time.
I might put it a little differently than that. Thank you. I might put it a little differently than that because what I meant to say and what I thought I said was that you have a kind of a spectrum of punishments, with the death penalty being for the very worst offenses. And I do see it as a difference in degree, but I really don't see it as a difference in kind. And let me underscore something that I said before, which is that if we're concerned about the irrevocability of punishments, if you serve 10 years, that's just as irrevocable. Even if the government cuts you a check and they say, well, you served 10 years for this, but we were wrong and you never should have served 10 years. Even if the government cuts you a check, I don't see that as great compensation for spending 10 years in prison on a bad charge or a wrong idea or whatever you want to call it. So in that sense, I think that a long sentence is just as irrevocable as the death penalty, because I'm not a believer that compensation really makes you whole in a case like this.
Thank you, Dan. Sam, would you like to respond? I mean, very briefly, I would say, there's irrevocability and then there's irrevocability, right? It's the idea that, if if you serve, a term of years, 20 years, even if it's wrongfully, and you get out, and that's the same kind of loss that you would encounter as if you're executed by the state. I think that's a false equivalence. I understand your point that you can't get back 10 years, no amount of money is going to make you whole, or after, a term of years that, that punishment is, you can't take that back. But at the same time, what you lose from an execution, it's, I think, a completely different order from what you would lose from a term of years.
I mean, I just very briefly, I mean, that's got to be wrong, because what if you die of natural causes while you're serving your sentence? So I mean, it seems like that's got to be wrong.
Okay. Let's go to the next question. Or Dan, did you complete your thought?
Forgive me. I probably not only completed my thought, but went on for too long, and I apologize.
No, we're all good. We're all good. We are going to the floor now for another question, Miss.
I wish that we as a society would clarify what exactly it is that we expect from our criminal justice system. Do we want people off the streets and separated from people in order to not continue to do harm to us, to protect us? Do we want deterrence so that people are less likely to be inclined to commit crimes? I think those are both, of course, reasonable things to expect, purposes of our criminal justice system. But why exactly do we feel it's our right to inflict vengeance on people who commit crimes? I don't really understand the logic.
Okay.
I mean, I get
Good question.
that certain victims might feel like that might make them feel better. I don't know that it even does make many of them feel better, and I don't know that it really ought to be our role in society to be doling out vengeance.
Okay. Thank you, Lainey. And Sam, if you don't mind, would you like to respond first to this? Otherwise, Dan can.
Sure, I can respond to that.
Okay.
I would say that I think there are people of good faith that fall down on both sides of this discussion. People, thoughtful, reflective people, can agree and disagree on the morality of the death penalty. But what you talked about is what is the function of our criminal justice system supposed to be? And I think regardless of how you come down on the morality of the death penalty, I think all the data we have shows that the death penalty does not help our criminal justice system work better. We're pouring tons of money into this that we could be spending on a myriad of other things. Make our justice system actually, if we want to invest money in rehabilitation, if we want to make safer prisons, if we want to have better funded prosecutors and police offices, those are all things we could be doing with the money we're choosing to spend on the death penalty, things that we know actually do reduce crime, that actually does make us safer. So even if you are invested in the idea that there is moral justification for retribution through the death penalty, I think if you just look at the fact, this is not a smart, efficient use of limited public resources. So just, I don't like I think people that are pro death penalty from a moral side, I think that's fine. I obviously disagree with you, but just from a pragmatic standpoint, we can and should do better than what we're doing right now.
Thank you, Sam. I appreciate your response. Dan?
Well, I think that what we just heard was a point about vengeance, and vengeance is wicked, right? I mean, I hope we all agree that vengeance is wicked, and what I think that our criminal justice system tries to do is substitute something that's less dangerous, that we try to call justice, in exchange for vengeance. And the reason I put that slide up there is that I think vengeance is like a really deep urge in people who've been wronged. And the reason we have government to handle these urges of vengeance and to try to have a neutral party carry them out and so forth is to have a less dangerous society, because we can't have people carrying out their grudges privately all day long. I think that the reason that there's support for the criminal justice system and support for punishment as such is it's a better alternative than vengeance, and it's just a little different than vengeance. And so I hope that it works as a substitute for vengeance so that we don't have these private feuds being carried out by by everyone, which I think is just a very powerful urge by people. That's what the punishment system is supposed to substitute for.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate that. We are at 10:49. We have been asked to conclude by 10:50, so we're running pretty close. And we can field another question maybe after the closing remarks. No, I don't think we have time. I apologize. Dan, beginning with you, if you wish, do you have some? This is a great conversation to have about the death penalty. I wish we could do this for a little while longer because I find it so interesting. Dan, do you have some closing remarks you want to make? No pressure.
I would just say that I appreciate the work that Sam is doing because we live in an imperfect world, and it's very important for each of us to try to make the world a little bit of a better place than it is now. And I think that many of the points that I've seen Sam make in other forums, in this one, suggest that our institutions of criminal justice are not perfect. They are not all that they could be. I think perhaps it's possible to draw the wrong conclusion from that, which is that it's impossible to have a good criminal justice system. It's impossible to have one that works well. I think that if we improve it, it will work better. And indeed, I think that for very rare cases, for very unusual cases, in cases of great wickedness, I think that the death penalty is appropriate.
Thank you, Dan. Sam, closing remarks?
I'd like to, again, thanks to Reason in the Rock, to Rudy, for Dan. I think it's been a great event. I would just say that, our criminal justice system, it is imperfect. But, the difference is I do think we need to strive to fix it. But as long as there are people that are involved in criminal justice, there will be mistakes made. Racism, implicit or overt, will play a role in the criminal justice system. Economic disparities, just plain human, wrongheadedness, mistakes will play a part of the criminal justice system. And because that is an immutable feature of the way we do criminal justice, because people are involved, I think we just can't afford to be placing literally decisions of life and death as part of that. So once we can fix human nature, maybe then we can talk about having a death penalty. But until then, I think it's probably a good idea to, I'm saying it's on the table eventually once we perfect humankind. Okay. But until we reach that point, I think it's probably, we should maybe step back and say, we can do better than this. We need to work within the constraints we have. And I think a step in the right direction would be getting rid of capital punishment. So thank you all.
I want to thank Dan and Sam Kooistra, Dan Greenberg and Sam Kooistra today. Thank you for participating. Very brave. And thank you all for participating, the people that asked questions.